You gotta do hard things. You gotta do hard things that aren't tied to survival. Maybe you don't, but I'm really bad at this. I tend to do things that are always constantly pitting against survival. Like, for example, your job. Like, if you don't do your job right, or if you don't do your job at all, you could get fired, and that would mean that you'd have to live out on the streets, and then, well, potentially you could die, or you're more likely to die. Your body tries to take care of yourself, it tries to keep you alive. It's kind of its job. And so, when it's tied to survival, you get a little. Sometimes you try too hard, it gets a little emotional, and things get messy. But when you play a video game on the hardest difficulty, like I do, or at least like I've been doing lately, I haven't typically done this, it allows your brain to focus in. As the people say now in the gaming world, it's time to lock in. What that allows you to do is it allows you to have little wins in a playing field that is not real life. And my theory is that this allows you to accept the ups and downs of life a little bit more effectively because you're practicing, so to speak, in a video game setting that isn't tied to your literal survival. It's just a video game. If you fail, you can just spawn in and load up your game and try again. Playing a video game on the hardest difficulty is not something I normally do because I didn't find it enjoying. I get frustrated too easy. I still get frustrated. That's okay. It happens. Y'all get frustrated at a video game. That frustration can be a good thing because it allows you to practice in a world that doesn't have that high of stakes. But I want to win. And allowing myself to want to win allows me to actually win. Make fewer mistakes. Allows me to lock in a little bit more. Allows me to be a little bit more aware. And ironically, I die a whole lot less in this difficulty than I do on simpler difficulties. Because with simpler difficulties, I like to go fast, which is a challenge in and of itself. But in doing so, I make more mistakes. Because I know I can take more hits, and then pretty soon, you get your ass whooped. And you're like, I'm on the lowest difficulty, but because you aren't thinking about things and you just rush into things, often like we do in life, we end up failing. Or we try too hard. We try to focus too much. If we just let go of the outcome, then usually can do much better. And ironically, that's kind of how life is too. If we can just not care so much about the outcome and not be so afraid that every little bad decision is going to somehow lead to an end that will get you killed, then you'll learn to navigate this life a little bit better. Also, as you learn to not care so much about the failures that come your way and kind of roll with the punches, which isn't an easy skill to develop, takes resilience. But if you can do that, life's a little bit more easier. And so does this video game become a little bit more easier. Then you actually start to enjoy the challenge. But you gotta learn to win too. You gotta have the little wins. The little wins are really important. Because without them, you don't really have the motivation to keep going. These little wins that I'm doing here, these small little instances where I can win even when I'm being outmatched and outnumbered. Builds my confidence over time. Builds my confidence in the game, and ultimately sometimes can even build my confidence in life. Sometimes some of those things can translate over into real life situations, like a job, like having a family, learning to navigate all of this stuff and still making time for yourself, playing a video game. That's why it's so important that nothing else is tied to a survival. Because I'll give you another example of this. When the decisions that you make as a parent, that when they're so important, they're literally tied to another human being who has no prefrontal cortex, essentially, or barely any, and you have to be that for them. There's a lot of things. Everything becomes an emergency. There's anxieties that you don't even think about or realize until you actually become a parent. Those realities are tough, and they're scary. Like, afraid that your kid's going to somehow choke on something that you gave them. You double check the medicine cabinet to make sure that they didn't swallow a bottle of pills because you accidentally left it open. Everything again becomes such an emergency. That's why it's good for you to take time for yourself, and whenever you can, play a video game. Do a hobby that's challenging, whether it's playing a video game on hardest difficulty or a harder difficulty than you normally do, or whether it's playing Sudoku or knitting or sewing. It doesn't really matter. Do something that forces you to get locked in, forces you to really focus on something that, again, doesn't really matter and isn't tied to survival. I think that's important. Maybe it's just playing the guitar, developing that skill. It's hard, really hard at first, but if you can practice maybe playing one of your favorite songs, you'll get those small little wins that do eventually make up for the lost time, for all the time that you spent doing it, thinking that it was wasted, but really you're developing your emotional, cognitive ability. So many of us, we don't have much of a emotionally intelligent brain. We're pretty lacking in that. It's all because we were raised with emotionally immature parents. And that means we've got to really develop it on our own. So why not practice in a video game that doesn't really matter and isn't really tied to any sort of survival or the survival of our loved ones? And if you fail, you can just start over. Build up the little wins. You can become more resilient to the hard things in life. And you'll learn to enjoy the little wins more. Like when your credit score goes up, or when you were approved for a house. Those are, maybe your credit score is a little thing, but getting approved for a house is a big thing. So you start to appreciate the little things that build over time and make and eventually give you something that's truly amazing. That's a really big win. But you don't get those big wins until you do a lot of those little wins. So reward yourself, just like a video game does. A video game rewards you even for the small little wins, or at least a good video game will. The video games that hardly anybody plays are the video games that don't give you a whole lot of stuff for the little wins. And the loot isn't all that great. You know, people may stick around. You know, the hardcore fans will stick around, but the general public, most people, they want to see those little rewards. So do your kids. Everybody does. We're all human. We actually learn better because we're more motivated by the little wins that come our way. That's what's important. A good video game will reward you through the journey. So that way when you get those really big wins in a video game, you really defeat those bosses, and you get an even bigger reward, it makes it all that more rewarding. Life is the same exact way. And if you can do that, give yourself a hobby that's challenging, or whether it's a video game or not, it doesn't really matter. I choose to play video games. Whatever works for you, whatever's going to motivate you to do it. Do something that you actually love, but make it challenging. Don't just play games of the easiest difficulty just because you want to play through the story. And that's okay sometimes, and totally understandable, especially when you need to decompress. But every once in a while, challenge yourself a little bit. Do something a little bit harder, like play Cyberpunk on the hardest difficulty. Not something I would have normally done, but I'm learning to really enjoy it. I'm exploring things more. I'm paying closer attention to the loot that I get. It makes things more fun and interesting. Less monotonous. Too easy. And with that, have a good night.